Now to introduce Sidra Ahmad, former founder of the Rivers of Hope project of Islamophobic violence. Sidra is a fierce advocate for the rights of women and girls, contributes to these movements through writing, community organizing, and also speaking. She's the founder of the Rivers of Hope project of Islamophobic violence, which is a research-based initiative to support Muslim women survivors of Islamophobic harassment and abuse. Sidra also coordinates an anti-violence against women public education at the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, OCASI. She holds a Master's of Arts in Adult Education and Community Development from the University of Toronto. Please welcome Sidra.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really honored to be able to speak with everyone and to share a bit of my story and my thoughts with you today. So thank you so much for being here and for listening and giving up your evening for this discussion. So I'm going to start by taking you through a scene that I have been through, and maybe some others in the audience have as well. I'm sitting at my computer in the evening, looking over the news on social media, kind of at that place where you're tired and you're mindlessly scrolling through, ending the day, already had dinner. My eyes fixate on a story about a prominent man in the United States who has been accused of rape. Against my better judgment, I look at the story, I see how it's being shared, and I read some of the comments. Immediately, I'm kind of overwhelmed with what I see. People are saying things like, she's a liar. They're asking, why did it take her so long to report? People are calling her crazy. People are saying that she wants attention. People are saying that, well, since there are gaps in her story and she doesn't quite remember the order of how everything happened, it must not be true. It goes on, and all of a sudden I notice that the computer screen feels really bright, almost painful, but I still can't and I don't look away. I notice that my breathing has gone shallow, and in fact I'm holding my breath at this point. My chest feels tight and my heart is pounding. My mind starts to race, my thoughts are swirling, and then in comes a thought that has been with me many times, and that is, if I ever spoke up, they would say this about me as well. That if I ever shared my story or came forward, pressed charges, did X, Y, or Z, they would be saying these exact same things to me, that I wanted attention, that I had no proof, that I was a liar, that I was making it up because there were gaps in my memory, that means it's not true, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that conclusion that came into my mind makes my heart sink down into my stomach, and I feel sick. So I finally turn off the computer and try to get it out of my mind, have a cold glass of water, decide to read a nice book, and, hopefully get some sleep. And I do sleep, and I'm happy that I fall asleep, but I have bad dreams that night, but, could be worse. The next morning, I wake up, I get ready, I put myself together, I go to work, and when I get to work, a colleague asks me, oh, how's your evening last night? You had a long day yesterday, how's your evening? And I say, oh, it's fine. So that's a scene I wanted to start out with, and to let you know that it's been 7 years since I faced a sexual assault that turned my life upside down. But today, here, even though we're at an event talking about Me Too, and Me Too tends to push people to share their stories, I'm not going to share my story with you. I'm not here to share details about the assault, and I want to push back against the idea that survivors have to relive their trauma in front of people and put it all out there on display. Almost sometimes it feels like it's bordering on entertainment. I'm not sure why. And it's as if we're not deserving of consideration unless we give out all these graphic details. So I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to refuse to do that tonight. And instead, what I'm going to do is share the story of what happened to me after this sexual assault. What was the aftermath like? Because I really want people, my dream is that more people understand what survivors need in the months and years after something like this happens. what happens after someone says Me Too? And that's one thing that worries me about the hashtag, is that people feel like Me Too is the event, and then what happens afterwards? Who's there for the woman who tweets out her story at 1 a.m. with the hashtag? What supports does she have? So that's what I'm going to share with you about, what I like to call the long-term, or not what I like to call, what is called the long-term impact of sexual assault. So first I'll take you to the first 6 months afterwards. Immediately after the assault, I had post-traumatic stress. Most people think about this in terms of what soldiers get when they come back from war, the jumpy, but post-traumatic stress is something that happens to survivors of sexual assault. What did that look like? To be honest, it was so strange. My brain stopped working, So I had a job, and I was used to going to the job and doing work. And I remember just thinking, what, I'm just going to go back to my job and move on and do this work. And I was there sitting at my computer, and the lights weren't on. My brain stopped working. It was really shocking to me. I would space out. I lost a laptop on the subway. For some reason, that really bothers me. And I would cry uncontrollably. I was really on edge around men. Even male friends that I'd had for a long time, I just couldn't be around them. And this is huge. I withdrew from my social and professional network because the man who harmed me was part of that network. And surprise, surprise, he had a really good reputation there. He was really respected by a lot of our mutual friends and acquaintances. So what did I do in the state that I was in is I removed myself. I didn't think anyone would believe me. So I let go, and I stepped away from that whole career track. And, I really want to point that out because, as my, wonderful panelists have already shared, so often, in discussions about Me Too, and we think about, what about the man who's accused of sexual violence? What will be the impact on his life and on his career if someone comes forward and holds him accountable? Everything he's worked for and built, everything he's put together, his education, his craft, his art, that, people are very worried about that, but rarely do people worry about the impact of sexual violence on the survivor. What about her career? What about everything she's built? What about all the work she's put in? What about her art? No one's really mourning that. No one's really worried about that. And that double standard really doesn't pass the smell test for me. Recently we've seen a prominent Canadian perpetrator of sexual violence, Jian Ghomeshi. He was given this 7,000-word spread in a really high-profile literary magazine in the United States to share his story, which was a fabricated story. And he was given this huge audience to be able to do that. And, people were saying, well, why can't he make a comeback? What about his, again, his career? And I think about Lucy Decatur, who's one of the people he was violent towards. What about her career? Where did, she is not at the stage that she was before all of this happened, and people don't seem to be as worried about that. So, that's why I think it's so important to share these impacts with folks. So I had that PTSD, and I'm so fortunate that I was able to get counseling from an agency, and it was free, and I'm so grateful that it was free. I don't know what I would do without that. And there I learned a lot about okay, I'm not losing my mind. This is actually what happens. This is a natural reaction to incidents like this. And I learned about trauma. And one thing I learned about trauma that I think is so important, I wish everyone would know about this, is that when you're in a situation of assault, it's so terrifying that your brain can go into something called fight or flight mode. I'm sure everyone's heard about that, fight or flight mode. And when you're in fight or flight, in those times, often our memories don't work as well, so you'll hear things about I can't tell you if the person had a gray shirt or a blue shirt. I was trying to survive, right? But that's neurobiological. That's what happens in our brains. We have no control over it, fight or flight mode in a moment of trauma. But what happens is that's used to discredit survivors. What do you mean you don't remember if he had a gray or blue shirt? That must mean you're lying, And it's so frustrating to see that over and over. And I see that in my news feed a lot, over and over. How come she doesn't remember all the details? She must be lying. So that's one thing I would hope more people would be aware of. So, we've talked about a lot today. You've heard about some of the statistics. We know that 1 in 3 women will face sexual violence in her lifetime. But I want to point out that women who are facing other forms of oppression, in addition to sexism, are even more likely to be targeted for sexual violence. I think of Indigenous women and girls in Canada who face much higher rates of sexual violence than those who are not. And this is because of the legacy of colonialism, you know? And I think about how this past year, I'm not sure if folks were following the story of a 15-year-old named Tina Fontaine who was murdered. And the person who was accused of murdering her was a 55-year-old man, and there was a lot of evidence linking him to this murder. A jury found him not guilty, much to the horror of so many activists working on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous girls, right? So when we think about Me Too, we need to think about what are the additional oppressions at play here. I think about Black women and girls. You know, we know the founder of the Me Too movement is a Black woman, and she was pointing out to the fact that the sexual violence that affects Black girls is very underreported and undervalued. Black girls are sexualized at a very young age and treated as if they're adult women and not being seen as deserving of safety and protection. I think of women with physical or mental disabilities who we know face 3 times the rates of sexual violence as other women. I think of trans women, particularly trans women of color, who face very high rates of violence and often don't feel safe or welcome in services that are supposed to be there for women who experience violence. I also think about women who do not have permanent status in Canada, who are not permanent residents here, and who may fear accessing services or leaving their abuser because they're worried they'll be reported and get deported from the country. But the stories of these women, Indigenous women, Black women, trans women, women with disabilities, women without status, they are not typically the face of our stories when we talk about Me Too. They're not prominent or featured in our discussions, and you know, they're often not invited to these kinds of panels. And their tweets, when they tweet, they don't get that 60,000 replies overnight, right? So, you know, I think it's really important that we be critical of what's going on, even as we celebrate it. You know, many of the people on the panel have already mentioned that the Me Too movement was started by Tarana Burke, and she created the hashtag in order to raise awareness about the impact of sexual violence on Black girls. But it was only when rich, mostly white celebrities took up the hashtag, that's when people started paying attention. And I just ask, like, what does that tell us about whose stories matter, and what does that tell us about who's seen as worthy of protection and who's seen as disposable? And that's something that really needs to change. So everything I've been talking about with these different forms of oppression, I'm sure most people here have heard of a term called intersectionality. That's a term that was created by a Black feminist scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. She created this term simply to recognize the fact that not all women are oppressed in the same way. So even the statistics about the gender pay gap, yes, there's a gender pay gap between men and women, but the gender pay gap is even bigger when you talk about the pay gap between men and women of color. And even bigger than that when you think about the gender pay gap between white men and Indigenous women. It gets even bigger. So intersectionality helps us map out these different layers. And so what Kimberly Crenshaw argued and helped everyone understand is that when she experiences sexism in the world, it's overlayered by her experience of anti-Black racism. There's no separating it. And so her framework that she gifted everybody with has been extended to help us understand other kinds of intersecting oppressions. And I personally have benefited from that knowledge because it's helped me understand how the sexism I experience is shaped by the fact that I'm a Muslim, a visibly Muslim woman of color. It's all interlinked for me. My Muslimness impacts my experience of sexism. How does it do that? People often will assume that I'm weak, that I'm oppressed, and so on, right? So it's kind of sexism mixed with Islamophobia. There's no separating it from me. And that's why I believe that, you know, in these movements, we need to fight against all these multiple oppressions at once, or else we're only helping one kind of woman. So I am one of those people who is, you know, kind of torn. I'm inspired by the Me Too movement, but I don't currently see people like me and our stories represented in it, at least not in how it's shown in the media at large. And it is different. You know, not everyone has the same level of risk. It's risky for anyone to step forward as a survivor of sexual violence, but not everyone has the same level of risk. And I can share on a personal note, it's difficult for me to step forward as a survivor of sexual violence as a Muslim woman. It's difficult because there are so many stereotypes people have. It's kind of like, feels like walking through a minefield. If I share that I'm a survivor, people's first thought may be, well, I know who must have done that to her, these barbaric Muslim men, I saw this movie that, I'm sure it was exactly like that movie that I saw, and, the stereotypes go on and on. I can often see people's wheels turning when I speak, and, thinking that I'm meek and that I'm passive, all of these assumptions. The fact of the matter is, in my case, the perpetrator was a white non-Muslim man. That happened to be the perpetrator in my case. And indeed, I believe he targeted me because of Islamophobic stereotypes. I believe that he thought that I was weak, oppressed, and an easy target, and that was the logic that led to it. So again, for me, all of these things are linked. I can't separate one from the other. For me, I have to fight all of it at once. So I want to tell you a bit more about the long-term impact of sexual assault. Getting back to that thing about what after Me Too, how can we support people? How can we actually have a meaningful change so people don't feel alone? So I had that PTSD for the 6 months after, 6+ months, but with the trauma counseling, thank goodness, the tools I got there, things started to shift. I was sleeping better, I got a job that I was happy with. And this is the point that I think that society wants to say, let's draw a line. Okay, you're better now. You're done, right? You're done. Your free counseling sessions are up. You got a job, check, you're done. And I really, and it's difficult, and I've talked to many other survivors, it's difficult because hearing that you think, oh, I'm supposed to be better now, like, well, is something wrong with me? I'm not better. So this idea that survivors have to get over it within this predetermined point of time has to go. Because my experience has been that even though I was more functional, I still had, moments where there would be something that would bring me back to a lot of anxiety, even flashbacks or nightmares. It still stayed with me. And I know if I was speaking to any other survivor, if I told them that on the anniversary of the assault, when it was a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, those days are always still hard for me, almost as if it's happening again. And this is something, I always get nods from survivors. It's something that, survivors understand. And it's that I really got a lot of support from speaking with other survivors who know what it's like, but I want everyone to at least try to understand what it's like, because then we can start offering support that people need in the years after the assault. So I'm gonna, as I wrap up, I wanna say that, another thing that too often people want when they hear stories around Me Too is they want a story of triumph, right? They want to, the idea is by the end, I'm supposed to tell you, I'm 100% better now, and kind of have a neat picture, tie it up in a bow, and help everyone, kind of put it aside. But I don't have a story of triumph. The truth is, I still struggle. That story that I began with, that scene about being at the computer and then having a bit of a panic attack and the nightmares and all that sort of thing, that happened last week. It's been 7 years since the assault. So that is a message I want to give you all. The impact of trauma can be long-lasting. At least in my case it is, and in the case of many other people I've spoken to, it is. And I feel like that's a story that we need to get out there with Me Too, that this isn't a done deal after we share a story. So I don't want to leave you on a low note, though, because although I'm not giving you a story of triumph with really clean edges and a bow on it, I can share many ways that I've learned from my healing journey and from other survivors and use that to make a difference in the world, which I am truly happy about. As mentioned in the introduction, I coordinate an anti-violence against women educational campaign now, which is across the province, and it focuses on immigrant and refugee communities, and that's really cool. What motivates me is the idea that anyone who is in my position might be touched by the work that I do, and that really keeps me going. I've also launched a project on gendered Islamophobia, which is the specific form of discrimination and violence that Muslim women face. Because again, I believe that's why I was targeted, this idea that I'm weak. So it's an issue very close to my heart. And so the project is called Rivers of Hope. And in this project, I interviewed over 20 Muslim women who were survivors of Islamophobic violence and assault, including survivors of sexual assault. So I've taken their stories and I've written kind of an academic paper about it, but also made a toolkit, again, to put it out into the community, to kind of give people what I think might have been useful to me or others like me, right? And more than anything, this helps me feel like I'm not alone and helps me be part of helping other people feel like they're not alone, and that heals me. I truly believe that survivors know how to support each other like no one else can, because we understand. But my dream is that we create communities where everyone can offer that level of support. And I don't think it's impossible. I think it's a matter of education. So that leads me to the final point I want to leave with you all today. I just want to give some really concrete tips on how to support someone in your life who has been through sexual assault. Here are some things you can say to her right away. One is, I believe you. Don't underestimate the power of saying that. Second thing to say is, it's not your fault. You know, we had a wonderful overview of all the different rape myths that are out there. Women are trained to blame ourselves when these things happen. So tell her a million times if you need to, it's not your fault. Another really great one I learned is to thank her. You know, thank you for trusting me. It took you so much courage to tell me this. Thank you. Honoring what she's doing. Because that immediate reaction you give is going to be so important, because, you know, it can really make someone's healing journey sink or swim, the way that you treat them at the beginning. And then when you connect her with resources like the Assaulted Women's Helpline, which is a great place where you can, you know, learn about what services there are in your area, present her with those resources, but don't take over and push her. You know, that's really important. You know, with sexual assault, someone's power of choice has been taken away from them. So what we want to do when we're supporting them is give it back. Say, here's a resource. What do you want to do with it? You choose. Totally up to you. Whatever you choose, I'm behind you. So those simple steps can make a world of difference. And then I would ask you to get support for yourself, because I would encourage you to be there for her for the long haul, on the anniversaries, right? On the day where it feels like, you know what, I feel like I'm back to square one. Be there for her for the long haul, but in order to do that, make sure you have support yourself, because it's not easy. And, you know, finally, just educate yourself about sexual violence and, you know, the impact on survivors, how to offer support. There are so many resources, blogs, YouTube videos, articles, and books out there written. You know, in particular, I would suggest you read things and watch things that are made by survivors. There's so much great information out there. Don't rely on the splashy headlines and the way they will frame this issue. You can dig deeper and learn a lot. The more you know, you're going to be a really good friend to someone who's been through something like this. So I'll end by saying that 7 years ago, when I was sitting at home trying to figure out what to do next, I never would have imagined that part of what I would eventually do is stand at a podium and say anything like I've just said. But I'm happy that I have this opportunity. I'd never take being listened to for granted. It means the world to me, and so I'm grateful for that. And I just want to encourage everyone, you know, you've done a huge thing by being here today, to just keep educating yourself and being part of this, taking care of yourself, to build a world for survivors that, you know, beyond Me Too, is truly supportive of the long-term impact of trauma and creating communities that can really respond to and heal that trauma. You know, so if my sharing this story contributes one thing, I hope that it motivates you to, you know, keep in the fight, or if you're not in the fight, to join. So, thank you.